There's huge investor interest in China's shadow banking. There's enormous investor interest in Abenomics, whether it will be successful or not. But investors are also keenly aware of the increasingly difficult diplomatic relations between Japan and China. There is even fear and talk for the first time of conflict. Here to discuss this with me in the studio, we have Jamil Anderlini, Beijing Bureau Chief, and Jonathan Soble, Bureau Chief from Tokyo. Jamil, if I can start with you, is this just posturing, or do we really need to be worried about the possibility of conflict?
I think at this stage it's clearly posturing on both sides, that neither side has any interest whatsoever in going to war with each other. But we do have to worry, and you hear over and over from analysts, from diplomats, from even Chinese officials, the fear of a possible accidental conflict. Imagine, China late last year announced unilaterally announced that it had this new air defense identification zone. So you can imagine that a Japanese fighter plane is flying through this zone, and then a Chinese plane, which believes, the Chinese pilot believes this is his national territory. You could see how a collision would happen, and both sides would start, would have to respond.
Jonathan, how does this look from Tokyo?
I think the Japanese see this as something that is frustratingly outside their control, because the de facto situation is that Japan administers the islands that are under dispute. They see this as something where the Chinese are making a claim, pushing into their territory. All they can do is react, and they have to try and balance that reaction. On the one hand, you don't want to show what they might perceive as weakness, so that eventually the claims get greater and greater, and you find yourself losing control. On the other hand, they know that pushback of an aggressive nature might lead to exactly one of these kind of unplanned conflicts that Jamil was talking about.
Now, Japan's economy is increasingly dependent on China. Huge exports. China is increasingly a big consumer market. People say that they could never come to conflict because the economies are too intertwined. What's your view of that?
The economies certainly are intertwined. There's no question about that. And when you saw consumer boycotts of name brand Japanese goods, Japanese cars, for instance, within the last year, you had some Japanese car companies' sales going down 30% or more in China. So, and this is a big industry for Japan.
Jamil, could you see a situation in which the Chinese would take a political decision to punish Japan economically?
To some extent, you've already seen that, actually. I mean, we saw it a couple of years ago when the Chinese stopped exports of rare earths to Japan. They denied it at the time, but it was clear when you talk to anyone who was trading in rare earths, they said, yeah, they're just not selling to the Japanese. And rare earths very important for the electronics industry, for all sorts of things.
Now, you spoke about the possibility of an accident, but how about the possibility of China actually at one stage deciding to take on Japan militarily?
Not within the next decade, I'd say. After then, who knows? I mean, I think the most likely scenario where we would see the Chinese trying to take back the islands by force, no matter what the consequences, would be if China was collapsing internally.
And Jonathan, finally, we've been talking about this as though it were just Japan and China, but of course there is another huge player, the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about the US role in all of this?
Well, that's the crucial thing to remember, is that if you're talking about some theoretical military conflict, accidentally now, possibly intentional in a decade's time, say, you really have to look at what is the state of the Japan-US relationship at that time. Because, of course, China is not just looking at the repercussions of taking on Japan militarily, it's looking at taking on these two countries militarily, and the US, of course, being the stronger power. And the talk of a US pivot towards Asia is highly welcome in Tokyo, but there are also questions about whether the Obama administration will follow up, whether there is the resources and the will to really pour the attention into Asia that's been promised, and the Japanese would dearly like.
Well, certainly this is a very fluid situation. We'd never heard of these islands a few years ago. Now people are calling them Asia's Palestine. That may be an exaggeration. Let's hope so, but it's certainly an area that we need to keep our eye on. Thank you very much.